So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Ben Arp. We have a round of applause. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you for the introduction, and it's great to be in Nottingham. So I was asked to do more of a kind of a noob-friendly talk on Bitcoin, and kind of maybe the history of Bitcoin and how we got to things like Lightning and Liquid. But as always, when I come to these Bitcoin conferences, this isn't a room full of noobs. It's a room full of very with people with a great understanding of Bitcoin, and that makes me. This is why I get so bullish when I go to conferences. Is just talking to just general attendees. They often know more than some of the speakers who are speaking, including myself, about a bunch of topics. So I'm sure that I will say some things here which are wrong. Just ignore that and don't correct me as I go along. Hold your corrections till the end, then correct me at the end if you could. So the presentation I'm going to do is called A Cypherpunky Brief History of Bitcoin and Why I Like It. So these are the reasons I get very bullish about Bitcoin and the Bitcoin thesis and why I think Bitcoin needs to exist. And it all boils down really to freedom of transaction. And of course, that's freedom of speech, and freedom of speech is very important. So we had an example of one of the things which I do, which was the Bitcoin Switch project. In the video, we're doing our usual panel show I think we're getting it for the live stream, our usual panel show, which we do for the WCN. And in it, we're talking about Bitcoin. So it's talking heads, talking about Bitcoin topics. And in the show, similar to the onstage thing I did with the electrocution machine, if you didn't like what I was saying, I had a smoke machine hooked up and also had a car battery with a motor from a windscreen wiper attached to some of those fly swatters for my hands. So you could pay some QR codes and it would slap me or it would blow smoke in my face. So it's a fun video. I'll see if I can get on at the end. But that's another example of this. I like playing around with this new technology, which I feel is fertile ground for good ideas. You can throw good ideas around and they grow into these wonderful projects. And although they're goofy concepts, that very example of being able to send pennies through the internet without having to put in any of your personal details and then have something happen on a live stream in somebody else's, living room, I think is quite spectacular in itself. So I like playing around with the technology which we have. And I'm able to do that through a great project which I started and a bunch of great people work on called LM Bits, which I encourage everyone to go and have a look at some point if they can. But anyway, I'm not going to go into too much into the technical stuff I do in this talk. I'm more going to go into what got me excited about Bitcoin and also where I point people to, where people say, well, why Bitcoin? Why do we need Bitcoin? Why is Bitcoin important? So I'm going back to my teaching roots here because we've got some keywords. And this is when I thought I was going to be addressing like a room of noobs. But I think some of these words, maybe even like seasoned Bitcoiners, might not be too familiar with. So some keywords we're going to cover are cypherpunk, public key cryptography, public key, private key, hashing algorithm, proof of work, encryption, eCash, trusted third parties, free and open source software, blockchain, second layer, protocol development, cold wallet, hot wallet. So there's some of the keywords which we're going to be covering. And then by the end of the talk, hopefully everyone will know what those things are. And in the context in which I'm going to be talking about. The first document I point people to when they say why Bitcoin is a manifesto written by the Cypherpunks in 1993 by Eric Hughes. There was a crypto-anarchist manifesto which was written by a guy called Timothy C. May, but that then got kind of boiled down to really what the Cypherpunks were interested in and why they were doing this online activism so they could secure privacy for all of us. So early on the internet, privacy wasn't a given. The governments and military complex, they didn't want normal people to have access to privacy. So they had all these crazy laws around cryptography. So if you couldn't, one of the laws was that you couldn't like transport a cryptographic function where you can encode some data and then decode that data somewhere else, or encrypt that data and then encrypt it somewhere else. And then there's one of the laws which they had was that if you transported that code, just that data, just that computer science over a border, that you could be charged for smuggling munitions, so you could be charged for smuggling guns. So the cypherpunks fought against these crazy laws because they realized that in a free internet where people could interact like they do in everyday life, where we have privacy, that we needed those access to those tools. And they came together and they wrote this Cypherpunk manifesto. And I know plenty of, OG Bitcoiners who haven't actually read the Cypherpunk manifesto. And as you can see, it's such a small document. I'm going to read a little bit to you. So the opening paragraph is, privacy is necessary in an open society in the electronic age. Privacy is not secrecy. Privacy is a matter. A private matter is something that one doesn't want the whole world to know. But a secret matter is something that something one doesn't want to know. Privacy is the power to selectively reveal oneself to the world. And then it goes on to say, therefore, privacy in an open society requires anonymous transaction systems. Until now, cash has been the primary such system. An anonymous transaction system is not a secret transaction system. An anonymous transaction system empowers individuals to reveal their identity when desired, only when desired. This is the essence of privacy. And then privacy in an open society requires cryptography. If I say something, I want it only to be heard by those whom I intend it for. If the content of my speech is available to the world, I have no privacy. To encrypt is to indicate the desire for privacy, and to encrypt with weak cryptography is to indicate not much desire for privacy. And then later on it goes on to say, where are we? Cypherpunks write code. We know, I just lost my link. What do we get from here? Cypherpunks write code. We know that someone has to build the software to defend privacy. And since we can't get privacy unless we all do, we're going to write it. We publish our code so that other fellow crypto cypherpunks may practice and something. So basically, cypherpunks write code. They knew that large faceless organizations and governments weren't going to give them access to this important liberating software of cryptography. So they knew they would have to build the software and also fight the regulations so if people could have access to these amazing tools. A good example of that is, anyone heard about it? Everyone knows who Adam Back is. I assume most people do in this room. Adam Back was quite pivotal during this campaign, and he actually printed like cryptographic functions on T-shirts, which people would wear, and they would get on planes and then travel to different countries to make mockery of those laws. They would also write cryptographic functions into books, and they would have them printed in books, and then they would send those books over borders as well, which then put America in a sticky situation with, the freedom of speech, First Amendment laws, whatever. Another great cypherpunk in the mailing list was Julian Assange, who of course went on to make WikiLeaks, and he built a whole bunch of important tools for cypherpunks. And Hashcash. So Hashcash, that was another one of Adam Back's inventions. One of the things which the cypherpunks built was they were very excited about email. So you could email, you could message each other over the internet. Wow, it's amazing. Probably as excited about email as we are about Bitcoin. But they knew that it wasn't private and you didn't have encryption. So they invented these things called remailers, where I could encrypt an email and then send it to a remailer. They would remail it to someone else, and then it would eventually end up to the destination where I wanted to go. And it would mean that if you intercepted the email on the hops, you wouldn't know exactly where it was supposed to be going. The problem was that the remailing system which they built for sending these emails would get spammed quite heavily, probably by US government, UK government, because they really didn't want this technology to exist. So Adam Back came up with this idea of Hashcash, which was that you take the email and then your computer runs a hashing algorithm through it until it finds a specific hash which has a number of zeros on the end. And it would require some work. So your computer's going to have to do this for like 30 seconds, a minute or something. And then once it's done that, it sends it to the remailer network. The remailer network can verify that you've done that work very easily, and it can pass on that email. So you can still spam the remailer network for email, but it's going to cost you a lot of computational power, which ultimately costs you electricity. And this is that first example of using proof of work to prevent spam. So this is why, Adam Back is, of course, a legend. Hal Finney, another great and important cypherpunk, he created reusable proof of work, which was taking the idea of Hashcash and thinking, well, hey, maybe we could even use that proof of work, and we could use this as a way of sending value, transacting value over the internet as well. And Hal Finney had that great quote, which was, it became obvious to me that these tools which can use to controllers can be used to liberators, referring to computers and cryptography. A lot of the cypherpunks were influenced by the work of a guy called David Chaum, who was a cryptographer who wrote papers in the early 80s, created something called eCash, which is a way in which you could have anonymous and private transactions over the internet. We'll talk about a little bit more about him a little bit later on. Over here in the corner here, you can't really see it, but there's actually a computer game, The Adventures of Tron, by Mattel. That was also made by Hal Finney, the Cypherpunk, and it's one of my favorite examples of how Hal Finney's work. Because in the game, Tron is like risking life and limb. It's like an Amstrad game. He's like a platform game. He's risking life and limb to collect all these collectibles inside his little digital world, and he's like having to avoid all these bad guys who are going to kill him. But then, if you really think about it, in the digital world at that point, like everything can be copied and pasted. Like on the internet, you can just copy and paste, make more copies. There's no scarcity. And in our world, scarcity is so important. So why is Tron making all that effort to go and collect all those little collectibles? So when Hal Finney was the lead designer of that game, he was sat back in 1982 at Mattel thinking, digital scarcity, how could that be possible? So I encourage everybody, you can get it from activism.net /cypherpunk. You can get the Cypherpunk's manifesto. It's a very small document. This is where I point people still today when they say, and people who know nothing about cypherpunks, know nothing about Bitcoin, and they say, why is Bitcoin important? Because it just outlines the thesis as to why Bitcoin is important. This is a bit of a tangent, but I was thinking, and maybe I should have included this as part of the theme for the presentation. I was actually thinking about being in Nottingham, that Robin Hood would probably be a cypherpunk. That he was, one of the things about this code which they were writing, it needed to exist in a sort of commons platform in a free and open source way, so it wasn't controlled by some company. And if you think about it, like Robin Hood, he was protecting the forests, the commons, and in fact the idea of Robin Hood probably came from the Jar of the Forest, with the document, the Cis document of Magna Carta, and then he was attacking the rich by unifying the people together. And then doing direct action as an anarchist. He wasn't just sitting around talking about these things. He was actually getting involved. He was writing code. So Robin Hood was, in fact, a bit of a cypherpunk in my mind. So with any new revolutionary technology like Bitcoin, there's a whole collection of technology which needs to exist, and they all exist at the right time. And then that's when you have this new amazing tooling, which you can use for liberation. This really was just public key cryptography. So public key cryptography empowers so many things. And for those of you who've heard of Nostr, that's something more recently we're building up using public key cryptography. But basically, it enables users to control their data, to encrypt data privately, and to be able to send it through, open networks, which everybody can see in a way which is private and encrypted. So where did cryptography come from? Obviously, we first had the Caesar cipher, because Julius Caesar wanted to communicate to his generals, so he created this very rudimentary way we just scramble up the alphabet and then write letters and then send them off to his generals, and if the letters were intercepted, people couldn't unscramble them. Obviously that became more complex over time, and you had the Enigma machine during the war, and then Turing came up with a computer for Colossus to decrypt these communications which the Germans were having. So then the problem becomes with this system of cryptography is, in order for us to encrypt some data, we need to meet and we need to have a handshake where we share a cipher, but we share a complex version of this. And then we're going to encrypt data and then over the public network send that data to one another. And there were two cryptographers who came up with this amazing idea of public key cryptography, which is where you use a private key and a public key. The public key can be public, everyone has access to it. You can see my public key. I can encrypt some data using the private key, which is connected to the public key. I can send over that public data. You can verify that data has come from me because I've signed it. And then we could use something called a Wilhelm and Duffy encryption scheme, which is where we combine keys. So one of the coolest things about, and this blew my mind when I wrapped my head around this, I have a private key, which is just a string of numbers and data and letters. I have a public key, which is the same. I can take your public key and my private key and create a secret. You can take my public key, which you can see on the open network, and your private key, and then you can create the same secret. Magically, it's maths. And then we can encrypt data with that secret and send it back and forth to one another. And it's so infinitely hard to brute force and unencrypt that data. We can send that over that public network, over the radio waves, or over the internet, in fact. And this is the thing which governments didn't want normal people to have access to. And this is the thing which cypherpunks fought for us to have access to. And normal people, every time someone makes a purchase on Amazon or uses any, HTTPS, you're using encryption and you're using the tools which the cypherpunks for. So outside of Bitcoin, the whole world who uses the internet is, should be very grateful for the cypherpunks. The other important part of what makes Bitcoin possible, you've got public key cryptography, okay? The other thing which makes Bitcoin possible is just free and open source software. Like whatever existed for this anonymous transaction system, it couldn't be owned by a corporation, it couldn't be proprietary software, it couldn't be something which could be changed at whim. It had to be something which had like a consensus mechanism. It had to be something which had like anyone could look at the code and make sure it wasn't doing any double spending, it wasn't stealing anybody's money. And free and open source itself is its own revolution. So to begin with in software, computer programmers would just make software and they would share it with each other. It's computer science. It's science. Share the science. And then these companies came along like IBM and they wanted to own the software, which they paid the developers to make. So they came up with all these proprietary licenses, which meant that if you'd wrote some software, you couldn't then share it with your friends. And there were a few brave developers who were on good salaries, such as Richard Stallman, who were like, nah, sucks. We want to be able to write our own software, share it with our friends, everybody contributes to it, and we build this thing together. And the first thing they did, what Richard Stallman did, was to break away and they create the GNU public license. Just the first paragraph is, the licensing agreements of most software companies try to keep users at the mercy of those companies. By contrast, our general public license is intended to guarantee your freedom to share and change free software. To make sure that the software is free for all its users, the general public license applies to all Free Software Foundation software and to any other program whose authors commit to using it. You can use it for your programs too. So just by making this license, it means that anyone who's making software at home, they can apply this license, then just give it out to the world for free. Other people can contribute to it. And this was such a niche concept, and everyone thought it was ridiculous. But then, by the mid-90s, Apple and Microsoft were starting to get worried about people like Linus Torvalds who were developing Linux, because they realized the power when you get all these hacky developers working in their spare time on software collectively. And then that lot, they all kind of worked on making it much easier to work on free and open source software, which is another talk on its own, so I won't go into that. But public key crypto, free and open source software, the cypherpunks and their aspirations, which they'd had since, the late 80s, early 90s, and then and our Cypher Manifesto was 1993. And it's showing that Bitcoin wasn't created in 2008. This isn't just some new hacky internet tool. This is something people have been theorizing about and lots of clever people have been working on. And they just needed the right technologies at the right time. So there were a couple of attempts at doing payments online, did like private payments online. And this is another solution which Bitcoin has to try and solve, okay, which is online payments and trusted third parties. So if I'm doing an online payment, you need a trusted third party for the payment to kind of go through, all right? So the David Chaum, who I spoke about before, who invented eCash, he created a company called DigiCash, which at one point was the most successful digital payments rails. I think in 2004, they had like 30 million in eCash out there. No, sorry, I'm talking about eGold. But yeah, so eCash, it wasn't the most successful one, but it was almost bought by Microsoft, but then it wasn't bought by Microsoft. But DigiCash was a company run by Chaum, and he wasn't a particularly good businessman, and the company went bust, and then the eCash project failed. But the basic way in which an eCash works is you have a mint, you send it money, they send you something which they say is pegged to that amount of money, and then you're able to then send that to somebody else over the internet. The mint itself doesn't know the balances of what anyone has or what anyone is spending their money on, but the mint needs to exist. So when DigiCash went bust, that meant that the mint went away. eGold was another good example. So this was, you could have gold receipts and you could send them over the internet and use it as currency. And I think you could do it up to the microns of gold. It was really very cool. And again, it was private, so they didn't keep a ledger of exactly what users were spending their eGold on. Again, the only problem was trusted third party. You had a company, you had a CEO. The CEO was facing, in the early 2000s, was facing like 70 years imprisonment for operating without money transfer law, money laundering, and all the criminal activities in which people were using eGold for. So that sucked. And then you had Confinity. They came up with the PayPal, which was Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and that lot. Originally, they had the aspirations of DigiCash and eGold, that you would have more of a digitally native medium of exchange, a currency you could use over the internet. But they soon realized with these two, the failure of these two, that actually the way in which to continue operating and be successful as a company is just do the settlement. So the settlement between banks. Some would say that maybe, they got into bed with government, and there's lots of interesting data if you run a settlement layer and you're able to share that data with people. Anyway, but they survived for whatever reason, and they were a successful trusted third party. So we have the trusted third party problem. We have these great new tools, public key cryptography, free and open source software, and then Satoshi drops the Bitcoin white paper on the Cypherpunky mailing list. At that time, it was called the cryptography mailing list, but this is a small mailing list of a few thousand people: Julian Assange, Adam Back, Timothy C. May, Nick Szabo, just a small mailing list, and he drops the Bitcoin white paper. And in the Bitcoin white paper, of course, he outlines the idea behind Bitcoin and how Bitcoin will work. And then a few months later, in early 2009, he then releases the first client of Bitcoin Core, which is terrible software, but it was smushing together all those ideas. And the innovation really was one of the innovations which made, so you still have a trusted third party, yeah? But that trusted third party is the blockchain. It's no longer a company, it's no longer an organization, it's a decentralized blockchain in which, for those who don't know, and like how a blockchain will work is you have a bunch of transactions and then a bunch of people compete doing that thing which Adam Back invented, that hash cache, proof of work. And so they have a hashing algorithm which just hashes through these big block of transactions, and then it gets a unique fingerprint, a hash at the end. And if it's got a certain amount of zeros, then it wins the prize, and it gets the miner, the person securing that block, gets some Bitcoin, which they can then release into the system. And then with every new block which is made, includes the hash of the old block. So they end up with a chain of blocks of these transactions, which is very powerful. It means that you can then have that, decentralized, trusted third party. I've spoken about FOSS development, free and open source development. Bitcoin then, it went from being this hacky code base written in .NET to there being a bunch of different type clients, and then more of a accessible protocol, which has the BIP system, so it could be modular. So you could build your own Bitcoin client if you really want to, and you could just incorporate the different BIPs into that client. And again, made possible because if it weren't for all the work of people working on things like Linux and all the other free and open source software, and developing things like Git, which is a way in which free and open source software developers can work on the same project without working on the same stuff and treading on each other's toes, then Bitcoin would be incredibly hard to work on. But thankfully, we have this great thing called Git, which most people access through GitHub, and you can go to Bitcoin Core's GitHub repo, and you can see all the commits which are going in. You can review the code yourself. You can get involved if you want to. It's not actually as hard as you think to get involved in contributing to this software. Just reviewing code and firing up issues on a Git repo is very useful for developers. And you could even propose a BIP if you want to. So if you think there's some way in which Bitcoin could be improved. So then we have Bitcoin, and it works. And we have, this is on-chain Bitcoin. And we have our on-chain Bitcoin tooling. So early in the day, I think Simon was talking about this. People would have meetups and they would buy and sell Bitcoin in real life. And then we had local Bitcoins, a way for people to do that in real life and online. And then we have Bitcoin exchanges pop up. I put Kraken on here because I think it's like the oldest running Bitcoin exchange which hasn't been hacked. So it's one which is worth recommending, I think. And then we have ways in which we can secure our Bitcoin. We can have it in a wallet on our phone, or we can have it in cold storage on something like a Trezor, or if we want to, we can have like a paper wallet. So there's a whole bunch of ways in which you can store that on-chain Bitcoin. But Bitcoin on-chain has limitations. And when Satoshi first proposed Bitcoin and published the white paper, the response he got back was, sounds great, it's not going to scale. Because you can't include every transaction which has ever existed on a blockchain. It's insane. All the transactions which happen in the world. So, in 2000, whenever we were complaining that Bitcoin could only do about 3 transactions a second, and actual usable payment networks like Visa can do like 25,000 transactions a second. It's like, how can we create that? So when it comes to protocol development, if you think about the internet, if we go back to the internet like HTTPS or HTTP, that sits on top of other protocols such as TCP, and then you have IP, and then you have layers of protocols. So the idea is, okay, on-chain is really good at doing this thing of having this like a system you're unable to brute force, double spend, or steal money, and it has this amazing blockchain thing, but it doesn't scale. How can we do lots of microtransactions? How can I pay for my beer and my coffee? How can everyone do that and have access to that? So in 2017, I think it's 2017 or maybe 18, Lightning Network went live, and that's another protocol which sits on top of Bitcoin, and that allows us to do regular normal payments. And for me, the greatest thing about when a new protocol exists, like Bitcoin or like the Lightning Network, which sits on top of Bitcoin, is it becomes this blank canvas, this new tool which you can build things with. So we've seen from the free and open source, permissionless development environment of Bitcoin and people working on the Lightning Network, all these people working on this interesting software and use cases for Bitcoin. And now we have like, points of sale, and then we have like the bulk cards. So you can do like traditional tap and pay for payments. You don't have to keep your phone wallet on you the whole time. It's just using all these tools together. We also have another second layer as well, like Liquid. Liquid is a blockchain which is managed by Blockstream, and they have a federation of functionaries. And those functionaries, they validate transactions. There's about 20 of them. They're all geographically separated, and they have unique hardware for being part of that functionary system. And it's kind of, okay, it's not as censorship resistant as something like Bitcoin on-chain, but it's certainly censorship resistant enough for, medium-sized amounts. With Lightning Network, I would say that we've replaced Visa Network and those traditional payment rails with something far superior and scales infinitely. And it's pretty easy to set up if you're a business or a bit technical. But we're still like 5% of the work has been done, and we still need to do 95% of the work to make it available to absolutely everybody. But it is entirely possible to make it available to absolutely everybody. A brief overview of how Lightning Network works. It's actually quite fascinating. Satoshi came up with this idea of a payment channel. So say if you're doing high-frequency trading on NTDocs, that's the example he used at the time, which is a Bitcoin exchange, you might want to open a transaction, but not close that transaction, but then use something called a time lock, and then update the state of that transaction. So keep sending your few Satoshis to that transaction until you're happy, and then do trades with that transaction, and then close the transaction. And then Christian Decker, I think it might be Mike. Christian Decker came up with the idea of a bi-directional payment channel, which is you could open a transaction, someone else could open a transaction to you, and you could send funds back and forth to one another. So a good example is, we're gambling through the night. I stake half a Bitcoin, you stake half a Bitcoin. Every time I win, I get 0.1. Every time you win, you get 0.1. We flip a coin. And then when we're both happy, we finish gambling. We then close those channels, and I walk away with my 0.8 and you walk away with your 0.2. Then the next innovation was, with this bi-directional payment channel, was let's network them together. So I have a bi-directional payment channel with you, but I haven't got one with you. And I want to send you funds. So I can send some funds through you, and then it will hop through the system, through the network. This is why it's the Lightning Network. And we can send that transaction instantly, the speed of light, to the recipient through the network of nodes. And then some second layer tooling. We have things like the POS. We have the Jade, which is a great hardware wallet for Liquid. We have Lightning nodes like the Raspberry Blitz project. We have things like Bolts, which is great for like swapping in between Liquid, Lightning, on-chain. And then shameless shill of LMBits. We have LMBits, Suite, which is like an online web wallet if you want to use a web wallet, and it has all these extensions, so you know all this crazy stuff. And then we also have Zebedee, who are here, which focus on enabling computer games to have Lightning payments in and Bitcoin payments in. So if we're going back to those keywords, have we covered those keywords? How much time have I got, by the way? Oh, sorry. So Cypherpunk, we know what cypherpunks are. Read the Cypherpunk manifesto, activism.net/cypherpunk. Public keys of cryptography, we now know what that is. Public key, private key, we know what they are. Hashing algorithm, we know what that is. Proof of work, encryption, trusted third parties, free and open source software, blockchain, second layer, protocol development, kind of touched upon that. Cold wallet, hot wallet, eCash, we kind of touched upon those concepts there. So I had to whiz through quite a lot of things, but ultimately it's that the Bitcoin project isn't a recent phenomenon. It's been a project which has been bubbling away for 40 years by a bunch of, really important activists, which allow us to have privacy on the internet. And that's pretty much it, I would say. Oh, shameless shill. If you're interested in like the maker side of Bitcoin, so the people who work on projects like developing stuff, we have some great Telegram groups. We've got the MakerBits group. We focus on hardware. There's about 800 of us who just build like all sorts of hacky hardware, like the Slappy machine and the electrocution machine. We've got the Bits Telegram group, which is the software I work on, which is fun. And then I won't talk about the other one, but the other one's the Nostr protocol Telegram group for anyone's interested in Nostr stuff. But apart from that, I don't suppose I've got time for any questions, have I?
Yes. So let's have some questions, because it's always great to have Ben at any event. So round of applause, thank you. And a quick 1 or 2 questions. Do we have any from the floor? Yes, Abby? Do you know anything about Fedimint, for those who couldn't hear?
Yeah, sure. So eCash, which is what we spoke, the paper written by David Shulman in 82, and then the company he tried to make, DigiCash, which failed. The idea of Fedimint is that you can avoid the mint from failing by federating it. I think eCash is very powerful, and it will play a big part in our future financial system. But I'm not sure on the incentives on running mints. So we created, so there's another eCash project called Cashew, which is made by a friend of mine called Callie. And in Bits, it was the first way in which you could spin up a Cashew mint. It's an extension, create Cashew mint, and then you create a Chaumian eCash mint, which people can send Bitcoin to you on Lightning, and you get these tokens back, which is the eCash, which you say is pegged to the Bitcoin. Now, we have a demo server for Bits, which we tell people not to use, and people can play around on. We have a lot of people running eCash mints on that demo server, to the point that we're turning off the eCash extension. We're disabling it, because I feel that people are worried about running mints, because you're not just doing money transfer, you're doing money. You could be argued that you're creating something. You're creating, a Liberty dollars, because you're creating something new, which you're saying is worth Bitcoin, and then you're taking the Bitcoin. So there is that risk that then what do you do with that Bitcoin in the back end? So for me, when it comes to mints, like I want to use like a regulated mint, which I know is unlikely to steal my money, because it operates with some sort of legal framework, which I know isn't very cypherpunky at all. But I'm not sure that regulators are going to allow that, because they generally haven't, like with things like the Liberty dollar and other systems where they've created a currency. Like countries generally like to have the monopoly over money production. I think that there's a great example of an eCash mint would be like El Salvador. They could create an El Salvador dollar, and then they could use an eCash mint for that, and it'd be interoperable with Bitcoin. That'd be cool. And I think then something like Fedimint, where you federate those mints to make the attack vector less centralized, makes sense. But I know that like just federating something doesn't make it secure. In fact, sometimes you can make it more insecure, because you can have things like Sybil attacks. And like if you look at all the shitcoins which had federations and failed miserably, and you look at Blockstream and like their federation, which they've spent millions on keeping. Like if you join the Blockstream Federation as a functionary, a guy comes on a plane with a box with custom hardware in, and then you have to be like geographically separate to another functionary, and then they install it for you. So they go to quite a long length to try and keep their federation honest. Federations are hard. eCash is cool. I love it a lot, but I do worry about people's expectations when it comes to it fixing anonymous payments or something, or because it's custodial and ultimately you're like printing money. You can call it, you can say it's a check or a token or something which represents Bitcoin, but there's no proof of reserves. Federations can be corrupted quite easily. Although I do feel that it is very important, like the Welsh pound. We could free Wales from you English colonialist and the US, the GBP hegemony, which rules over Wales with your Bank of England. and then we could create the Welsh pound. The federated Chomi knee cash makes perfect sense, and Fedimint makes perfect sense for that. But it would have to be done in a way which had some sort of legal framework underneath.
Right, enough of that Welsh story. I'm going to stop you there because Ben could go on forever. Hopefully that's answered your question comprehensively enough. Round of applause to Ben Art. Thank you very much.